I'm Caitlin.
I'm Elsa.
I'm Noe.
I'm Ronan.
And I'm Charlie.
And we are current Bates students studying psychopathology under Dr. Ellen Finch. Today we will be destigmatizing PTSD. First off, we're going to define stigma, and through Lincoln Felon in 2001, they defined it as the co-occurrence of labeling, stereotyping, separation, status loss, and discrimination that occurs between groups in a context in which unequal power is exercised. This can be attached to demographic features of a person's identity, such as race, gender, and sexuality, as well as to conditions that are experienced or acquired throughout the lifespan. Exposure to stigma presents a substantial risk to physical and mental health, and stigmatized groups, which is a driver of population health inequalities. There are 3 levels of stigma. There's self-stigma, which is intrapersonal, which is internalized stigma related to one's mental health difficulties. There's public stigma, which is interpersonal, which is stereotypes and consequent discriminatory behaviors endorsed by society at large. And finally, there's structural stigma, which is how institutional policies intentionally or unintentionally lead to adverse consequences for people with mental illness. Many who have been diagnosed with PTSD have also been known to experience intense public and consequently self-stigma. In a study done by Mittel et al. In 2013, they explored how stigma related to post-traumatic stress disorder among combat veterans has consequently made them reluctant to seek help. Upon return from combat, they have been described as being labeled as violent or dangerous, due particularly to their military experience and knowledge. Some participants wrote that, and I quote, "I think the majority of them just don't understand it, so it frightens them, and they don't want to deal with it. They don't know if you're reliable. They don't know if you're going to snap and hurt somebody. They don't know, a lot of them have probably grown up with the exaggerated versions we used to see on TV of the Vietnam vet guy, the exaggerated versions, see what they always have. But I think that's kind of the impression they have." They also felt that the public blamed them because they volunteered for service. For example, one participant wrote, "Strangers, they blame you. It is your fault for having PTSD. They treat you like trash or the old shoes they don't care about." Participants also grew to agree with these the dangerousness stereotype that the public puts on them, and they also began to believe that they were weak because they had developed PTSD. One participant wrote that they expressed that they didn't understand why they weren't strong enough to be able to turn the symptoms off, and they didn't understand why they couldn't just say what they had experienced was horrible and get over it. Because of this crazy label that they receive, again, they feel reluctant to seek treatment, and they also feel that their PTSD warrants less sympathy because it is not something like rape or a natural disaster, which elicits more public sympathy. Overall, the study talked about how combat veterans seeking PTSD treatments often face stigma, including stereotypes that they are violent and crazy, which discourages them from seeking help. Many feel blame for the condition because they volunteered for service, leading some to internalize these views and see themselves as weak. Overall, the participants believe that society offers less sympathy for combat-related PTSD compared to PTSD from natural disasters or rape. When looking into this topic, we also found that patients with PTSD differed in their experiences of stigma based on their gender.
So according to a study done by Heather Caldwell and Sean Lauderdale in 2018, they focused on public stigma for men and women veterans with combat-related PTSD. And kind of when it comes to like dangerousness, research shows that people with PTSD are viewed as like unpredictable, dangerous, and it's best to avoid them. And so in the study, participants rated that male veterans are significantly more dangerous and fear-provoking than female veterans. It kind of shows that in the public mind, combat experience combined with PTSD really strengthens the stigma and stereotype associated with dangerousness with these veterans, and it also kind of reaffirms gender stereotypes. Women can be viewed as like less physically threatening, but that doesn't eliminate the stigma that they face. Female veterans are more likely to be viewed as like needing help, and they're seen as less responsible for their symptoms. and they're also viewed with more sympathy, but they can be perceived with like less competence, going off of the idea that like women are like fragile. Male veterans, on the other hand, are viewed with like greater fear. There's a higher perceived risk, and we see a stronger avoidance of male veterans than women. And this kind of comes with like there's like a less willingness to like live near them, maybe less willing to trust them, etc. Male veterans are seen as more responsible, that they should be able to control their emotions better, and we also see that men with PTSD are more believed than women. Like men do not necessarily have to prove that they experience combat, while women might. And we also see that males are less likely to be helped than women.
In addition to finding that PTSD patients experience stigma differently based on their gender, we also found that public stigma can be influenced by whether or not someone discloses the trauma that led to their PTSD diagnosis.
In a 2022 study by Thibodeau and Merges, they discussed how there is, on the one hand, there's a support the troops mentality that among Americans, but on the other hand, there are negative stereotypes among combat veterans of referring to them as taking time bombs and prone to volatility as a result of their combat experience. In the study, they discussed how participants desired less social distance from individuals with PTSD when the patient was described as an Army veteran versus a civilian. A higher proportion of participants were willing to donate to a fictional trauma organization when the participants were described as an Army veteran. These effects were small, and researchers noted that the direction of these effects were opposite to those obtained in other published studies, suggesting that factors like gender of the service member or their status may influence public evaluation. Disclosure of sexual assault was subject to weaker stereotyped attitudes than disclosure of physical assault or no specific trauma. Researchers suggested that disclosing a specific assault may make PTSD diagnosis appear normal or perhaps even inevitable, lowering the perception of otherness and reducing the impulse to keep distance. Ultimately, the study found that public stigma of PTSD was reduced when the details of the traumatic event were disclosed.
More generally, as a result of public stigma, self-stigma can have major consequences. In a study by Corrigan et al., focuses on two consequences of self-stigma. First, loss of self-respect. Second, a pattern the researchers called the why-try effect, which is a sense of futility where someone starts thinking, why even try to work? Why try to go to school? Why try to be active in my community? It's the feeling that you're not capable or not worthy of pursuing goals because of your mental illness. To really study this, the researchers built a new measure called the why-try stigma scale. It includes statements like, I am not capable of working a good job because I have a mental illness, or I am not worthy to vote in an election because I have a mental illness. These statements capture how self-stigma gets translated into real behavior, or more accurately, the lack of behavior. When people endorse these beliefs, they're basically talking themselves out of action before anything even starts. Then they tested two different models of how self-stigma unfolds. The original model suggests a step-by-step process where people become aware of stereotypes about mental illness, and then they agree with them, and then apply those beliefs to themselves. Eventually, this leads to a decrease in self-respect and an increase in why-try thoughts. But when the researchers tested this, things didn't line up, and awareness didn't predict agreement. Just because someone knows that society holds certain beliefs doesn't mean they accept them. In fact, in this study, more than half of participants were aware of stereotypes, but only around 3% agreed with them. So the researchers tested a second model where one that doesn't depend on awareness being the starting point, and this one fit the data really well. In this model, once a person agrees with stereotypes and applies them to themselves, two things happen. One path leads to diminished self-respect, and the other leads directly to the why-try effect. Losing self-respect didn't automatically cause someone to give up on their goals. The why-try effect had its own distinct pathway. After mapping out these relationships, the researchers looked at how these experiences relate to mental health outcomes. Both diminished self-respect and the why-try effect were linked to higher depression and lower recovery. People who endorsed the why-try effect were also more likely to agree with public stigma. This connects to the earlier article where people started to adopt the negative feelings about themselves because the public has been so negative towards them. The outside stigma gets internalized and starts influencing how people view their own abilities and futures. This shows self-stigma as something that operates on both an emotional level and a behavioral level. Emotionally, it undermines self-respect. Behaviorally, it shuts down motivation. And these effects ripple outward into depression, empowerment, and recovery. The authors say that future interventions can't just focus on improving self-esteem. They also need to directly target this sense of behavior of futility, the belief that trying isn't worth it. They suggest strategies like cognitive behavioral approaches, peer support programs, and disclosure-focused interventions that help people reshape their relationship to their diagnosis and challenge those internalized symptoms.
Now we're going to be addressing some of the misconceptions that are often involving PTSD or other mental illnesses. In an article in 2022 by Tori DeAngelis, some misconceptions were that many people diagnosed with PTSD or other mental illnesses may be unpredictable or dangerous, and in many of the articles that others have mentioned, DeAngelis says that if a person has a severe mental illness, they may have other risk factors for violent behavior. He says, so if it may not be mental illness that is driving the violence at all, but rather factors like having been abused as a child, being unemployed, or living in a high-crime neighborhood. He also notes that it is important to learn that these issues not be resolved to better treat these individuals and to aid their families and communities, but to combat the misperception that most people with serious mental illness are violent, because it's often not the case. Another misconception is that only major traumatic experiences like combat or major assaults would warrant PTSD. The DSM notes that this is not the case by stating exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence in one or more of the following ways: directly experiencing the traumatic event, witnessing in person the events that it occurred to others, learning that the traumatic event or events occurred to a close family member or close friend, in cases of actual or threatened death of a family member or friends, and the event or events must have been violent or accidental. Experiencing repeated or extreme exposure to aversive detail of traumatic event or events. Example, first responder collecting human remains, police officers repeatedly exposed to detail of child abuse. And to note that criterion A does not apply to exposure through electronic media, television, movies, or pictures unless this exposure is work-related. Another misconception is often the way that media perpetuates negative or fearful symptoms of PTSD. This was mentioned in the article that Caitlin discussed, but some examples include Grey's Anatomy, when Owen Hunt, a main character, is suffering from PTSD related to combat and how that affects his interpersonal relationship with Sandra Oh's character. And I think many people perceive that as PTSD being primarily negative symptoms as opposed to the holistic detail of that diagnosis.
And then another example is from The Hunger Games, the second movie, when Katniss is hunting and she has a flashback to the Hunger Games, to which she ends up shooting one of the contestants. She has pretty much a mental breakdown and almost attacks her hunting partner. This just further shows how the media portrays PTSD as something that's violent, something that could be potentially dangerous and unpredictable.
Another example of this is in Criminal Minds, where a ton of episodes show someone with trauma having violent outbursts, impulsive behavior, or extreme flashbacks. It really pushes the stereotype that PTSD makes people dangerous or unstable, which isn't accurate.
So the last piece of this podcast discussion is to mitigate these level of stigma, self-public, and structural that we've seen throughout the articles and lived experiences of those diagnosed with PTSD or other severe mental illnesses. The first one is to use person-centered language because a person is not defined by their mental illness, and it is strictly an identity marker that reflects only a sliver of who they are and what they can do.
This relates to the Thibodeau and Burgess article and discusses how we can decrease public stigma by discussing more openly these challenges.
The next mitigation is providing a group-centered opportunity for conversations between people who have experienced PTSD, as well as providing the opportunity within family or other dynamics to share their experience.
This relates to the Mitchell et al. 2013 article where many veterans exclaimed that peer-based outreach and therapy groups helped veterans engage in treatment early and resist stigma.
The third piece of mitigation is educating yourself and others on lived experience and how to be a resource when needed, asking questions, and staying curious.
And based on the lived experiences and through education, we can break down stigma and stereotyping revolving around gender and cultural assumptions with PTSD. Misunderstanding of combat trauma can lead public misconceptions of an exaggerated sense of danger with these combat veterans. And this also goes into the overestimation of the risk of violence from these individuals, and that PTSD is not predictive of harmful behavior.
The last mitigation strategy we provide is allowing for open conversations surrounding mental health so that people don't feel consumed by their symptoms or diagnosis and understand the depth of their social support.
That's all we have for today. Thank you for listening to Deconstructing Stigma around PTSD.
Please like, subscribe, and comment down below any follow-up questions you may have.
Until next time.